Well, welcome to the Post Sunday app. Thanks for joining us for this video. We're glad to be able to talk about the sermon a little bit more here.
Yeah.
And we have so many questions, Daniel.
It's overwhelming a little bit.
We give us a quick overview, and then we'll jump right in. So you
We're
preached
studying
on.
the Pentateuch.
Let's jump right in.
First 5 books of the Bible. I mean, this, I don't think we've ever had so many questions come in such a quick period of time.
I know.
And that's just from you and me.
Exactly.
So I think we got a lot to do.
Let's tackle one of the big questions here that came from our look at the Pentateuch yesterday, and that is, as you approach the text, are you coming from a dispensational or covenantal perspective? Maybe define those first and then tell us your perspective.
Right, and this is how long is our video supposed to be here?
About 3 hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just broadly speaking, there's the kind of dispensational and covenant. And dispensational, Charles Ryrie was kind of one of the people who championed maybe the more revised, what we call revised dispensationalism. And he said there's 3 elements of dispensationalism. There's this idea that you're going to take the Old Testament literally, just going to be a grammatical, historical interpretation of the Bible. So you're going to say if God promised some things to Israel, he meant this is going to go to Israel. There's a belief that there's a separation a distinction between Israel and the church, and that continues today, a distinction between Israel and the church. That would be one of the marks of dispensationalism. And then also that the purpose, and I can't remember exactly how he worded this, but the purpose of history and Scripture and all things is to glorify God. And really, if you think about Christians throughout history, I think at least on 2 of those, they're going to be in agreement. A covenant person is going to say, yeah, I think I should practice grammatical, historical interpretation of Scripture, and I believe the purpose of history is to glorify God. So really it becomes the distinction between Israel and the church. A person who's a covenant theologian, or would say they're a covenant Christian, would say, okay, I think that God has worked in history through covenants that he's made with his people. So there's a covenant of there's a covenant in eternity past between the members of the Trinity. There's a covenant of creation. There's a covenant with Noah, then with Abraham, and God has used these covenants in his dealing with people. And now the church is the recipient of the covenant made with Israel. And so the church, some would use the term replaced Israel, others would say fulfillment. There's different words and nuances, and we won't go into all of that. The question is, where do I fall in that? And one of the cool things that's happened is that if covenant theologians over here have seen almost no distinction between Israel and the church, and dispensational theologians have seen this very severe distinction between Israel and the church, I think people in both camps have kind of moved more toward the center.
Yeah.
And there's some new covenant theologians who see that there is a distinction somewhat between Israel and the church in some places, and dispensationalists, like progressive dispensationalists, see that the church is the recipients of a lot of the covenants that God promised to Israel. So I would put myself probably in the progressive dispensational camp, and yet I see a lot of benefit of the new covenant theology.
Okay.
There's a book written that's called A Kingdom Through Covenants by a couple professors from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and essentially those guys are covenant theologians who baptize believers instead of babies. I mean, that's kind of where they are. But they kind of see that this overarching covenant that God has made with creation, and this overarching covenant with Noah, and then the special covenant with Abraham. And they have this diagram where it kind of each of the subsequent covenants kind of is fuller fulfillment of that covenant promise made to Abraham, and now the church is recipient of this covenant, and I think there's a lot to that. So, bottom line, when I come to the Old Testament, I'm seeing, I like this idea of God bringing in his kingdom through covenants. I think the church is not just completely distinct from Israel. I think the church is recipients of this covenant that God has made with Israel, and so I like a lot of the covenant theology there, but I am approaching the Old Testament as a dispensationalist in the sense that I do believe that these promises God made to Israel, many of them are literally going to be fulfilled in the future, and that hasn't happened yet. And so that's how I'm approaching the Pentateuch.
Okay.
I could go on.
Yeah.
I've probably already gone on a little too long, but
well, okay. So if that's how you're interpreting, that's the
Yeah.
lens in which you're going to interpret.
Yeah.
This idea then of we're not the audience in the Pentateuch, but of the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
How do you read the Scripture? How do you read some of the ceremonial laws, and
Yeah.
how do we apply those in 2015?
Yeah. So let me kind of clarify what I was saying yesterday. I said that we have to be careful not to confuse the audience in the Pentateuch with the audience of the Pentateuch. And the audience in the Pentateuch is the audience that's there in the story. So Moses speaking to the Israelites in the plains of Moab, or
Right.
the people in the wilderness, or God speaking to Noah. Noah's the audience in the Pentateuch. And then there's an audience of the Pentateuch. And the original audience of the Pentateuch is also not us. The original audience of the Pentateuch are people who are entering the promised land with the purpose of learning how to live a life of faith. And that's kind of the main idea. We're living a life of faith and obedience. So it's not about legalistic obedience to the law. It's about loving God and living by faith. Now, because God is the divine author, there's a human author, but because God is the divine author presenting the story of redemption, we're the audiences of that message. And so we come to the Pentateuch and we say, okay, here we are. We know who the promised seed was in Genesis chapter 3. We know who the sacrificial lamb is in the book of Exodus. We know who the promised prophet is in Deuteronomy. Now we're approaching this and we're saying, okay, what do we find out about ourselves, about God's character, about His plan of redemption? And that's what we're finding out as we go to the Pentateuch. We're not finding out about law. We're not finding out in terms of, we aren't the audience of the Pentateuch. The law wasn't given to us so that we could obey it. The law was given to the people of Israel so they could live by faith. And in fact, interestingly enough, this is sometimes something I think we miss. The law was given, as Paul says in Galatians, and I think Moses is making this point too. There was Abraham, and Abraham is reckoned as righteous by faith, and then after Abraham comes the law, and then the more law comes after the people sin in the book of Exodus. We're going to unpack all this, but bottom line, as we look at the Pentateuch, we can find out about the character of God, knowing that these laws aren't written for us, written for another audience, but we're the audience that sees them in light of the whole plan of redemption, learning about who God is and how we're supposed to respond by faith in God. That's the essence.
Yeah.
Live by faith. Message to the original audience, message to us.
And so I think that answers well that question of, well then, we're not picking and choosing.
Right, exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
we're not the audience of that law.
Right.
But we're seeing that law in the context of the greater redemption story.
Right.
Is that
right.
a fair
I
way?
think that's excellent. And we can't dismiss that. We can't pick and choose and say, well, I don't want to live by faith like God is calling me to do through the story of the Pentateuch. I can't pick and choose that. I've got to be obedient to that. But I understand that this is given to a specific people at a specific time, and I'm not those people.
Okay. Now let me say this. This is a little longer,
Oh, yeah.
but I think we're going to go a little overtime here.
Okay.
Post-Sunday.
I'm
Is
ready.
that okay?
Let me stretch out.
Yeah.
Feeling pretty good.
Okay.
Hydrated.
Yeah, good. So just to go a little bit longer
And
here.
people can pause.
So-
They can pause anytime.
and they can hydrate themselves.
Right.
If they'd
So
like.
if you need, step back if you need a moment here, and just make sure you're ready.
Good. All right. Well, to go further here, you asked, one person wrote in that said that you asked a rhetorical question and they don't remember if you answered it or not. So this might be helpful for others as well.
Isn't the definition of a rhetorical question one that you're not
That you
going
don't answer. Let's try it anyway.
That was a rhetorical question.
When Jesus said Moses wrote of him, was he referring to a single obscure verse or something broader?
Yeah, and so something broader.
Something broader.
I think
Okay.
whenever he says that Moses wrote of him, he's saying the story of the Pentateuch is about God's plan of redemption. And if you believe that, this is in John chapter 5, verse 46, if you'd believed what Moses was writing about this prophet who would come after, this king who would come after, this better priestly system, this better covenant, if you believe that, you would see this all points to me.
Okay. We had a last question here. Did you want to try to address that
I
one?
think we're
or
good.
You think we covered that in some of our previous stuff?
I don't think there's any question. We actually have a lot. I mean, if people could see this, there's just
There's a lot of questions.
There's some really, really good questions, and we're going to
Yeah.
keep the questions that people send in
We are.
on an Evernote file, of course.
Of course.
And we're going to keep going to these, going to this well as we keep going through this series.
Yeah, today
I'm excited.
I am too. You know, today we tried to answer the questions that were most pertinent to yesterday's sermon. We did save a lot of these questions were, hey, you're probably going to get to this, but in case you don't, here's a question that I have about the Pentateuch and how we live that out. So.
And each week, maybe we should tell people what to read ahead. So, because we're not going to cover every verse in terms of reading it out loud. So, next week, people need to be reading Genesis 1 and 2.
Okay, that's what we're going to be hearing this Sunday. So, looking forward to that. So, thanks for joining us on the Post Sunday app, and have a great rest of your day.